So in my last video, I talked a little bit about storytelling and what I hoped for in Guild Wars 3. However, we do have 13 or 14 years of Guild Wars 2 to consider and take a look at. And I personally believe that the story and lore of this game are a big driving factor for people to engage with the franchise. And overall, it's some of the most played content in terms of what actually drives people to purchase the expansions outside of gameplay features. There has not been any expansion without a story. There is no like featured DLC, at least not yet. So it goes to show that the story, at least to some degree, is an important selling point. So we're going to take a look at exactly that, the story of Guild Wars 2 and how they chose to tell that story and what kind of release quality they have and so on and so forth. While a tier list for this would be fitting for this kind of video, I think I'm going to just give them grades similar to like academic. So A+ being some of the best Guild Wars 2 has to offer, while lower grades will be fitting. Once again, it's all subjective, but I'll try to justify my grades as we go. A couple of disclaimers: I am an ArenaNet partner, so if any of this content looks interesting to you, feel free to hit up my referral link in the description below to support the channel at no additional cost to you, and spoilers ahead. So with that, let's get started. The Guild Wars 2 core game revolves around the Zhaitan dragon alongside the origin of the pack, and it gives us a foundation of the story. I'm not going to get into every little detail, but we get introduced to the Order of Whispers, the Priory, the Vigil, alongside an introduction to the races of Tyria, which the only real new one is the Sylvari. The rest were present in Guild Wars 1. The storytelling is largely told through instances and side-by-side cutscenes that everybody more or less did not like. I think the core game story and the side stories like dungeon storylines were pretty alright. They were typically okay. Some story instances were pretty lackluster for what it's worth, but it was alright. I'm gonna give the core game a C.
I mean, it's
the core
alright,
game itself has a lot of cool things going for it, and even if you have no expansions and are a free-to-play player, it is still a blast to play through, and the storytelling elements are rather mid if you exclude like fractals and dungeons, which are actually kind of like A+ in terms of story and gameplay in most cases. Now I'm gonna loop in Living World Season 1 with the core game because it is a part of the core game, but it was released in segments originally, and this is the way I remember that season, largely from the temporary segmented releases and not from the new re-edition of the various gameplay elements and stuff that they had. And let me tell you, doing the Attack on Lion's Ark meta back in the day and the Battle of Lion's Ark was an absolute insane time to be a Guild Wars 2 player. The player population was through the roof. Lion's Ark was an instance, like the actual town was the instance, and ArenaNet basically nuked their primary player hub, and there were no premium lounges or anything at that point, so Lion's Ark was just it. So it was very disruptive and it felt very real. However, with that's like the high points. There were also story segments that were released where you just had to like basically talk to 2 NPCs and repair like 15 signs, and that was the entire update. Overall, the actual lore and the story of Scarlet putting together the Toxic Molten Alliance was a good way to introduce new factions. I think Scarlet was a relatively threatening, even though she was kind of cartoonish of a villain. I'm sure that was by design, but we have 3 instances from that time that got returned. We have the Twisted Marionette, we have the Tower of Nightmares, and the Battle for Lion's Ark metas. So we got some good gameplay elements that were added to showcase the happenings alongside some lackluster stuff. Story-wise, the side-by-side storytelling was more or less abandoned, and we are introduced to our band of misfits, which we'll be hearing a little bit more about. But overall, it was fairly good. I think Season 1 was a step up from core and kind of set a new baseline for what players were expecting at the time. I'm going to give the Living World season a C+.
I mean, it's alright,
moving in the right direction. So getting into Living World Season 2, this covers all of the pre-Heart of Thorn stuff, which follows a lot of the Sylvari storylines and subplots between the Nightmare Court and Cave Keith, and we get introduced to the whole dragon egg thing towards the end, and we get introduced to the fact that Sylvari were dragon minions. This story is largely told through flashbacks where you were playing other characters like Keith during the times that they were younger before they joined Destiny's Edge and all that. And there was a decent amount of experimentation in terms of gameplay. The story has some of the most challenging solo achievements to complete, which was extremely frustrating. And as part of this story, we got access to Drytop and the Silver Waste, which are now part of the core campaign. However, the story is still associated and locked behind Living World Season 2. Overall, there were some new ways to tell a story with different cinematics and different in-game NPCs talking to each other that looked and felt more like the releases that we have in present day. Combine this type of delivery with a far more structured episodic nature of the releases, and we have something that looks far more polished and repeatable and marketable than we did in Living World Season 1 and previous. Living World Season 1, we were basically getting slammed with updates and the Queen's Jubilee and all this and all that, and they even roped like elements of the Season 1 story with regular festival events that we have now, which is really adventurous and a cool way to tie into the story with what normally is just like a regular festival update. In Season 2, however, the storytelling and story quality were both superb. The gameplay elements were also great and provided probably a little too much challenge in some areas to players for those players at the time. Overall, Season 2, in terms of story, I give it like a B+. It served as a great setup for the Heart of Thorns expansion, which what we are speaking about now. Heart of Thorns is largely considered the golden era for the franchise by many of its veteran players. Realistically, it had it all, from a primary story of facing off with Mordramoth. The storytelling was told largely similar to Season 2 in terms of cutscenes instead of side-by-side stuff, meaningful story instances, good gameplay elements, the challenging achievements like Migraine on the Mind of Mordramoth fight was really nice. There was also an introduction of the Mastery system, and for what it's worth, the Mastery system at this stage of the game felt pretty meaningful and impactful as post-level 80 progression. There were areas that were like 100% cut off until you explored it further and got other masteries, and it really did feel nice that you had to like push the game forward and then circle back. This expansion really highlighted the concept of an event chain where you have a sectioned area and you have a set of events that follow each other to like tell a story. Some core areas had these, but this expansion expanded upon it. Everything felt really cohesive. We were also introduced to raids during the Heart of Thorns era release. These often get bundled together. However, the post Heart of Thorns storyline is what followed Wings 1 through 3, where we learned about the re-emergence of the White Mantle. Once again, a lot of really good voice acting and gameplay that tell a really cohesive story with a lot of mystery and intrigue. Well, these releases were like over an entire year between October 2015 and June of 2016. They were all kind of bundled together now with unlocking Heart of Thorns, and they kind of tie into everything and set everything up. The way Season 2 leads into Heart of Thorns, the raid storyline led us into Living World Season 3. However, Heart of Thorns and the raids are all A's, if not A+, for some of the best storytelling that the game has to offer, only surpassed by a few instances in later stories. This leads us to Living World Season 3. Now, Season 3 has a few different storylines that tie together up to this point. It seems like the story was not following like a real A and B plotline, but instead it was just setting up for like a single linear direction. Season 3 seemed to introduce a very apparent A and B plotline on many of its maps, where we were introduced to the White Mantle storyline from the setup of the raids, but also we were getting primed for the whole Elder Dragon thing. We were introduced to Lazarus the Dire, or reintroduced to him, and we also had some political intrigue stuff with Codicus. And overall, the Season 3 arc of Living World was some of the best, to be honest, but they told their story so well because they were releasing an entire map alongside the story. So we have a new map, we have new masteries, new weapons, in terms of like a new legendary weapon to make associated with that map. And these new maps often included some novelty function too, where it was like a little grappling hook like on Draconis Mons, or the Kodos Flame came in Bitterfrost Frontier. Besides these plot threads, the new maps did feel new and novel, and they fit in with their stories. You could definitely see the experimentation on the devs front, and some of the maps were definitely more lucrative and flushed out, which at the time it led the community to kind of speculate on the whole A and B map teams. Like if it was map team A, we were all really hype, and if it was map team B, we were a little bit more cautious. But Living World Season 3 was a very good season. You had Caudicus and his transformation akin to Matthias Gabriel with the whole Bloodstone arc, and of course you set up for the reveal of Balthazar. Living World Season 3 in my opinion was A tier content, with some episodes falling into B. Overall it was a good period in the game's development in terms of quality gameplay features, while also providing a decent and engaging story threads. There was a lot to speculate on. We also got Wing 4 during this time, and that's arguably one of the best wings in terms of scaling, difficulty, and storytelling, along with mechanics out of all of the raid wings. This leads us into Path of Fire. Now, Path of Fire was largely dealing with Balthazar, but you also got introduced to various other factions and a kind of world post Joko. Since largely we have a few different elements to consider here, we have Glint's Legacy, Oreen, Palawa Joko, the Sun Spears, and so on, and the maps themselves were designed around mounts. Largely they were trying to push into the desert to rally allies to fight against Balthazar. That is kind of the core story, and we did get some pretty engaging story instances. What people remember about Path of Fire was the mounts, but it also introduced was an insane amount of power creep through barrier and some of the other elite specs. This video isn't really about that per se, but Path of Fire story and gameplay wise was alright. I think that the bounty system did not do enough to fill the void of having those super in-depth event chains that Heart of Thorns had. Like, we have events where we're helping refugees and stuff, but in Heart of Thorns it felt like we were literally carving through the jungle and exploring with those people. In Path of Fire, the gameplay loop is just kind of like, hey, tag up, collect this bounty, go kill this thing, and that's it. Overall, I'd say Path of Fire is a B overall. The story is okay, story instances were fine, but it was really carried by the gameplay elements and primarily mounts, alongside the raids, which were released during Living World Season 4. Speaking of which, let's move on to Living World Season 4. Season 4 has some high and low points. The story is focused around a post-Balthazar Crystal Desert, with our two primary plot threads being Kralkatorrik and Palawa Ignatius Joko, both of which are a pretty big deal, and we spend most of Season 4 dealing with them. It's split 50-50 for the most part. Some episodes are Joko episodes and some are Kralkatorrik episodes. Typically the high points are episodes like War Eternal and All or Nothing, which introduced some really crazy storytelling and bold storytelling, and instance segments in Thunderhead's Peak and Dragonfall are incredible. While some of the lesser received episodes were like A Star to Guide Us with Jahai Bluffs or Long Live the Lich with Corona. Typically the story would be absolutely amazing and well done, high polish, and the map would be mediocre, or vice versa, where the map was awesome and we would get very little story progress from the actual storyline. For the most part, they were pumping out really high quality releases at this point. The Roller Beetle got introduced, the Sky Scale got introduced. We got Raid Wings 5, 6, and 7, which all have incredible stories. And for the most part, there was a culmination of a lot of different story threads, and a lot of different plots were coming to conclusions, and they were all done pretty well. I mean, even maps like Jahai Bluffs had pretty incredible meta events on them, cool rift style events and experimentation with like weather and different ecosystems that live in different bubbles on the same map. So I think that's really cool. And I think that Season 4 overall is an A, with some areas are as good as the game gets. The voice acting, the monologuing of Joko comes to mind as one of the most hype moments, while the pacing is highlighted excellently through the last couple of episodes. Without spoiling anything, those who lived through them know what I mean. It was indeed quite a spicy time in terms of the game's story. Now, some areas, however, were just straight up duds. The whole Plague Beetle arc in Corona was a big dud. That episode was carried by the introduction of the Roller Beetle and less so on the story. So I'd say that the highs were about A plus, best studios put out, while the lows were even as far as like a D- or lower. Some of them are completely forgettable nonsense, and I mean, even Corona right now is a completely dead map with no purpose outside of the roller beetle. But let's stop pooping on Corona. Let's go ahead and move forward. And here's where things get a little bit strange with the Ice Brood Saga. So the Ice Brood Saga was an uphill battle just because it was a shift from what we were used to. We had Living World Season 2, which was really good, into Heart of Thorns, which was great, Living World Season 3, which was awesome, into Path of Fire, which was all right, into Season 4, which had a really strong ending. And there were mixed episodes, but the end was pretty on top of the world. Like, everybody was really happy with the sky scale and the Dragonfall map, and we're looking forward to another absolute banger. And we got the Ice Brood Saga, which wasn't an expansion, it wasn't a Living World season, but they said it would have expansion level content. So what is the Ice Brood Saga about? Well, in short, it's about kind of a Char Civil War, the reconciliation with the Flame Legion to some degree, and then shifting directly into Jormag and Primordius story arcs, where we go into Bjorn Marches and interact with one of the darkest storylines that the studio has put out. Frankly, I was here for it and I liked it. I like the story that they were telling, and unfortunately we only really got halfway there. Even though at this point, like in present day, the maps are pretty dated. Grothmar, Drizzlewood Coast, Bjorn Marches, they all worked out pretty well and they all turned out really good. The storytelling and stuff of the scrying pool and strike missions and all of that stuff, we got to see a lot of really cool things through the Ice Brood Saga, along with some of that like season 2, like go back in time or kind of like live a story through somebody else's eyes type of gameplay. In retrospect, it feels a lot better than it did at the time. We weren't really getting quality of content or quantity of content through the Ice Brood Saga era. Even though like the quality of each release was pretty solid, it just like, you're talking about a really long period of time for not a whole lot of meat. I would say that the Ice Brood Saga is a C, and it was more or less a rough patch in the studio's history. We were basically on the brink. COVID happened. They were hit with a bunch of layoffs, and basically NCSoft told them, yo, you guys need to release an expansion. And that's how we got End of Dragons. Now, End of Dragons was super hyped. There was a lot of nostalgia around Cantha from Guild Wars 1. And frankly, outside of some of the system limitations that we have in Guild Wars, the End of Dragons map meta train is some of the best gameplay to be added to the open world. Dragon's End was a smash hit, even though it was a little bit overtuned for most people's liking at first. And frankly, the story was actually pretty well articulated. The main issue is one thing that happened, and it is the whole deep sea dragon thing. If you don't know, the deep sea dragon thing was a little meme that the community had going on. That deep sea dragon went by the name of Steve, and the deep sea dragon was responsible for the whole Karka incident that happened way back in season 1. And it also became a meme with Timey saying like, oh, what was the name of that dragon again? I think it started with an S. It became like a running joke. And then we got Suwan, the ocean dragon, or the mother of all dragons, or whatever, right? It's a friendly dragon, not the big bad thing that spooked the Karka into South Sun and into Lion's Arc. You know, it's just a big softie, which leads us to this whole like who was phone type of situation in Guild Wars 2, where things started to get retconned, which this whole deep sea dragon thing was the first part of a few parts that I felt detracted overall from their original story. But the End of Dragon story had a good amount of quality, reasonable storytelling with like the xenophobia of the Canthan people. We got to revisit, you know, the Jade Brotherhood, the Kurziks, the Luxons, and stuff like that, where you get to kind of hear their history and how like their intercultural racism or whatever you want to call it is kind of like a thing of the past, where you have NPCs talking about like, oh, come on, grandpa, you know, be nice. And you get that overall Canthan aesthetic, which is pretty nice. For the most part, it was pretty good. It was way more replayable playable than Path of Fire was, which was the last true expansion. And while we only missed out in a few areas, like the skiff and the turtle were kind of meh features alongside fishing, we did end up with Aurene legendary weapons and legendary variants, and the maps were unique and mostly lucrative. Like the meta trains still get run constantly to this day. The legendary weapons are still valuable. There's a ton of little side stories and collections and that expand in different areas and follow different people's backgrounds. The elite specs were fun. The maps were fun, the story was good, and it ended the whole dragon cycle thing. So now we were free to explore other topics. So what's there not to like? I personally give End of Dragons a B+, and had they released a raid wing with this bad boy, it would have been off the chain. We were coming off of the Icebrute Saga strike missions, and they did release strike missions that were actually good in End of Dragons, but I think that people were still kind of thirsting for that raid wing instead of just, oh, these challenging strike missions and stuff. It really did complicate the difficulty in group making a little bit, because these strike missions were, some of them were harder than raids on their normal mode. Some of them were the hardest content in the game at this point. So it did lead to some confusion. Now, this leads us into a topic that everybody kind of likes talking about. It's not my favorite topic to talk about, but Gaela Delve, which is also known as one of the worst updates in Guild Wars 2's history. Part of it was because, frankly, it was just complete ass. Maybe all of the world doing COVID made devs think that it would be a good idea to like wear a mask mechanic in the game, but we do have a wear your mask mechanic, which is kind of butt cheeks. But additionally, the whole Kanoxai and demons thing, the demons and the jade mines was something that got retconned later, and basically this entire patch doesn't matter. It has no relevance to anything. We got a little bit of post EOD story with Chol Mu being a douche, which, like, who gives a shit? This whole map, both episodes get an F from me. Like Gaela Delve Part 1, Gaela Delve Part 2, aka the tunnel, both of them are absolute dog shit. But there's hope, because we got Secrets of the Obscure. Following Gaela Delve, they redid their expansion model and announced Secrets of the Obscure, and for the first half of the release, the story was absolute banger. Like, I think everybody was really engaged. We had some cool stuff with the Wizard's Tower. We got to meet Mabon, who was a Mersat, which was crazy that they're reintroducing this race. And frankly, Zoja and the whole mind eraser beam as soon as we get to meet back up with her is kind of whack. I'm not sure why that even has relevance to the story. I'm sure that there's some lore reason why we had to like mind erase Zoja, Men in Black Zoja. But for the most part, the story started to fall apart, because now that the Cryptus existed, it seemed like the devs wanted everything to be a Cryptus. Like Deimos back in Wing 4 from years ago, yeah, they're a Cryptus. Kanoxai from way back from the deep in Guild Wars factions is actually a Cryptus, guys, and Cryptus came from the realm of dreams, which, I mean, why don't you just have multiple factions of demons? Why does everything need to be a Cryptus? Leave some of that lore open to interpretation, or have the opportunity to expand upon it, like the demon realm, because the realm of dreams, aka Inner Nyos, kind of just sucks and is boring. The reason why is because they completely neutered the Cryptus. Like, sure, some of them are still bad, but the vast majority of them are these like mindless trash mobs, or some helpless, scared blob that we need to help. The narrative shifts from there being like mind demons invading people's minds to like, we need to help these like poor helpless things overthrow an oppressive ruler. ArenaNet has also admitted that their pacing had problems here, and they didn't really have the space to tell the story that they were trying to tell. And this is going to be kind of a common thing moving along like post End of Dragons. For what it's worth though, in Secrets of the Obscure, the first two maps have very interesting concepts. One, the idea that you have like these alternate timelines that events occurred differently with little quest chains around the maps. That's pretty cool. Overall, the first two maps were very well done in terms of story and displaying that story through different event chains. There's also the inclusion of different lore about different bastions, which led led to like a straight up retcon of Wings 4, like as an old bastion that was somehow not a part of these existing ones anymore. And whereas before it was like an old jail with Mersat lore, now it was like somehow tied into this whole Cryptus narrative, which I don't really like the way that they kind of combine that. Just let it be a jail, you know. But for the most part, Secrets of the Obscure had scope problems. The Internios pivot ruined the storyline. Patha should have just stayed a baddie the whole time, and they should have just remained ambiguous with the overall tone of it. They could have kept the same actions without turning Patha to the good guy side. Like, let her be this kind of weirdly like sexual demon voice in the back of your head. Like, I really dislike how most of the story, many of the characters fall into distinctly black and white lines, and they started to blur the lines a little bit with characters like Patha, who really, you didn't know which side they were on. Like, everybody kind of wanted her to betray us. Like, that would have been more interesting. And frankly, I think this opens things up for engaging storytelling, where you have these ambiguous characters that sometimes help or sometimes hinder, not necessarily for any reason other than their own personal motivations. And I feel like that has been lacking. Another big problem is ArenaNet continued with the whole killing somebody you just met trope, and it felt super formulaic. Like, at this point, Air died, Elmore Soulkeeper died, Mytrin died, and now Mabon. And all these characters were fairly interesting. I guess like Air was kind of mid, but Alamora, Mytrin, and Mabon more or less wide open in terms of being able to tell good, engaging side stories. Like, it would have been sick if, you know, Mytrin and her band of Sky Pirates, they knew the way to cast Stora, for instance. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. I think for the most part, Soto was okay. The largest problem here is that they had a problem with development rollout and a lack of super engaging features. Weapon mastery was introduced, and that introduced a ton of power creep and so on. The story was like a C, where the first half was pretty engaging, and then they just led up to like a giant turd at the end, which is always disappointing. Following up Soto, we have Janthir Wilds, which was pretty hype because it introduced spears on land. That was what most people ever wanted to talk about and mention. And the reason why many people don't mention anything else is because this expansion is more or less all there is to say about it. The problem with Janthir Wilds, again, was a pacing issue and a super lack of stakes associated with the story. Really, they wanted to scale things back. We had world-ending disasters, traveling to the realm of dreams with Internios, and taking on like literal demon kings and stuff. And the dev team and the narrative team didn't have enough space to tell the story they wanted, so they had to cut things down a notch, slow things down a bit, and oh boy, did they. Janthir Wilds was about as inconsequential as they come. They introduced things like the Tyrian Alliance Council with a bunch of politicians who can't make up their minds about anything, and they decided that our expertise is best spent on going to Janthir, where apparently it's super crazy uninhabitable, and that's where the Mersat used to live, and to check out some reports on some strange happenings, right? Oh boy, what a great scene. Except when we get there, we meet the lowland Coden, which turned the entire expansion into the Berenstein Bears Island Adventure Simulator, where literally nothing mattered. You run around on your Warclaw, you decimate the local wildlife, and for the most part, you really didn't do anything meaningful. There were no meaningful event chains. They introduced homesteads, where most of the reward schemes were based around homesteads, and most of the events were also based around like homesteading, like doing manual labor and cleaning up Warclaw poop and stuff. You know, you had the Bog Queen and you had a meta event, but those two things aren't really as lucrative as they needed to be to engage people. Overall, the concept of the expansion was all right. I'm not exactly sure why they went the direction they did, but they did rope the Mersat origins into the Cryptus again. However, instead of them existing like in some alternate plane of the mist, they just said like, oh yeah, they're from the realm of dreams, which is whack because the realm of dreams is whack. We had another trope that we all hate to see, where we had a trope of bringing back a dead character in the form of a ghost to move the plot along, which is pretty weak. And the story overall seemed really disconjoined. There was a lot of Bloodstone stuff going on. There was this plot with the Titans and the plot with like Raging Sorrow or whatever her name was, with the fact that the bears hate magic for some reason. And all the culmination of all of these things was just, who cares? It had no impact whatsoever. It felt like the commander was sent off to this location to basically like do pest control, and at the end of it all, it was like tortured spirits or something manifesting as titans from the realm of torment. Like, I think the whole gate to the realm of torment thing and then sealing it up after being there for 5 minutes was the biggest wasted opportunity. They could have introduced a new threat that was behind everything, having Mabon's ghost seal up the gate, having the whole map be this titan that consumed a city and destroyed basically everything that made Bava Nissos interesting, was also a giant waste. Like, Bava Nissos was supposed to be a Mersat central hub city, think like Radisum for the Mersat, but instead we got some like bunk ass meta event, some weak storytelling, and overall I give Janthier Wilds an F. The first map was the only one that was actually fleshed out. Spears were nice. This expansion is one of the worst ever in terms of actual impactful, meaningful storytelling that introduced new lore that was actually worth learning about. The lore that was introduced was largely done through scattered collections and scattered pieces of paper, and unless you engaged with those aspects, you didn't have any idea what was going on or why we were doing things. And when something did happen in the story that you were engaging with, it was really underwhelming in a matter of gameplay. So finally, we are here at Visions of Eternity, and if you've watched this far, go ahead and hit subscribe and like for me. It does help me out quite a bit. But Visions of Eternity is largely one of the better story beats overall. The story itself is intriguing, though we do see some issues with pacing. We don't really know how the story is going to end just yet. We have one patch left before we're going to figure out what is going on with Vlox and the Inquest. However, we did get some more insight with the Seers. The maps so far have been really nice and definitely more flushed out than Janthier's or Soto's were. And I think that if they lead with this expansion, like had they led with Visions of Eternity, which they really couldn't do because like overlap between other characters and character development, I think the mini expansion model would have been better received. So far, I am giving Visions of Eternity a B. There are a few different ways to engage with the story in the open world. The maps feel alive based on the events they have available and the event chains they have. There are repeats of some events, however, there are a lot of little fun ones here and there. I'm interested in how they intend on finishing it off, and overall, it's okay. One of the things I did notice is that between the different expansions, this is one of 4 that has elite specializations, and in Heart of Thorns and Path of Fire and End of Dragons, those specializations felt like a true addition. Like, dragon hunters are out there in the world, and druids and hollowsmiths and stuff like that, and they did do that initially with the introduction of the new specializations, being like, oh, this Azura engineer found this mold and they're experimenting with it, and that's the source of this new specialization. Little things like that are very important to the cohesiveness of a story, and I'm glad that they included it, albeit on a much smaller scope than they did in the previous expansions. Like in End of Dragons, the Willbender and the Mechanist like felt like they had always existed in the world, whereas these ones kind of feel forced to some degree. It's a small thing. They tried, but didn't really hit as good as it did in the past. So with that, those are all of the Guild Wars 2 stories that are graded, my thoughts on them from a narrative perspective. And before I close out, I do want to say that I am an ArenaNet partner, and if this inspired you to purchase any of the content, please consider using my referral link down below. Like the video if you liked the video, and subscribe. I'm getting dangerously close to 10,000 subscribers, so that would be sick. So with that, thank you for watching. A big thanks to all my subscribers, and a special thanks to all my members who support the channel. Your support is more helpful to me than I can express, and I am eternally grateful. Thanks again, and I will catch you on the next one. Peace.